Meghan Markle walked into the Megyn Kelly show expecting a difficult conversation, but the exchange quickly became more tense than either side appeared to expect. For years, Megyn Kelly has questioned Meghan's public statements, media appearances, and the way her story has been presented to the public. Meghan, meanwhile, has faced repeated criticism over the way her public narrative has been discussed in the media. So when the two finally sat across from each other, the central question was simple. Could they have a serious conversation without reopening the same disagreements? Meghan began with direct questions. Meghan pushed back on the way those questions were framed. What followed was a growing disagreement over media coverage, fairness, and whether criticism of a public figure should be treated as legitimate scrutiny or personal hostility. The conversation eventually reached a point where Meghan's appearance was brought to an end. But what exactly happened between them? And did Meghan actually get kicked off the show, or was the situation simply a tense interview that ended early? Here is what the confrontation was about, why the exchange became so difficult, and what each side had to say. Megyn Kelly has built her career around direct interviews and strong opinions on major public issues. Meghan Markle, meanwhile, has spent years under intense media attention, particularly because of her relationship with the British royal family, her decision to step away from royal duties, and her later work in the media. That background makes any serious interview between Meghan and Megyn especially sensitive. Meghan has been critical of Meghan's public statements on several occasions, while Meghan has faced criticism from commentators who question whether her public narrative always matches the available facts. The tension in this story centers on that difference. Meghan would want the opportunity to explain her position in her own words, while Megyn would be expected to challenge statements she believed needed clarification. Rather than treating every disagreement as a personal attack, the interview would focus on the questions surrounding Meghan's public image, her media projects, and the decisions that have kept her in the public conversation. As the discussion continues, however, the disagreement becomes more direct. Meghan begins questioning Meghan's approach, while Meghan maintains that asking difficult questions is part of her job. And that is where the interview starts to change. What begins as a discussion between a public figure and a journalist gradually turns into a disagreement about fairness, criticism, and accountability, setting up the moment when the conversation reaches its breaking point. The interview begins with both Meghan Markle and Megyn Kelly appearing prepared for a serious conversation. There is no need for a long introduction because both already understand why the meeting has attracted attention. Meghan starts by acknowledging that she has been critical of Meghan's public statements in the past. Rather than avoiding that history, she makes it clear that the interview will address some of the issues directly. Meghan responds calmly at first, explaining that she believes much of the criticism surrounding her has been presented without enough context. She makes it clear that she wants the opportunity to explain her side rather than simply respond to previous headlines. Meghan then moves towards specific questions. Instead of asking Meghan whether she believes the media has treated her fairly, she focuses on particular statements and decisions that have received public attention. That approach immediately creates a difference between the two. Meghan wants the discussion to focus on how she believes she has been portrayed. Meghan wants to focus on what Meghan has actually said and done publicly. Meghan explains that asking questions about those statements is not necessarily an attack. From her perspective, public figures who discuss their experiences openly should also expect people to examine those claims. Meghan disagrees with that approach and argues that repeated questioning can create a negative impression regardless of the facts. At this stage, neither side has lost control of the conversation. But the disagreement is already clear. Meghan is asking for context and fairness, while Megyn is asking for specific answers. And that difference sets the tone for everything that follows. Meghan moves from general questions to a specific issue involving Meghan Markle's public statements. She asks Meghan to explain why some of her previous comments have been interpreted differently by journalists and commentators. Meghan argues that statements made in interviews are often taken out of context. She says that a short quotation cannot always represent everything she meant when discussing a complicated personal experience. Meghan acknowledges that context matters, but she points out that Meghan has also made many of these statements during highly publicized interviews. When a public figure chooses to speak publicly, Meghan argues, the public is entitled to examine those statements and ask whether they remain consistent over time. Meghan pushes back, saying that constant scrutiny can make it difficult for her to explain herself without being accused of changing her story. Meghan then asks a more specific question. If Meghan believes a particular report is inaccurate, which part is wrong? That question changes the direction of the discussion. Instead of debating whether the media has been generally fair or unfair, Megyn wants a clear example that can be examined. Megyn says the problem is not always one individual statement. In her view, it is the way multiple reports are combined to create a particular impression of her. Megyn responds that an impression can be debated, but factual claims can still be checked. The exchange remains controlled, but the disagreement is becoming clearer. Megyn believes the criticism reflects a larger bias against her, while Megyn maintains that her questions are based on publicly available statements and events. Neither accepts the other's explanation, and the interview moves toward more difficult questions. The discussion becomes more direct when Megyn Kelly asks Meghan Markle about the criticism surrounding her public image. Megyn points out that Meghan has spoken openly about difficult experiences while also objecting when those same experiences are examined by commentators. Megyn says there is a difference between sharing her own story and giving journalists permission to question her motives. She argues that some coverage has focused less on what she actually said and more on creating a negative interpretation of her character. Megyn disagrees. She explains that criticism of a public figure is not automatically a personal attack. If Megyn makes a public claim, Megyn says, it is reasonable to ask whether the available information supports that claim. Megyn responds that the same standard should apply to journalists. She questions whether Megyn approaches her coverage with an open mind or whether she has already decided what she thinks about Megyn. Megyn answers that having an opinion does not prevent her from asking questions. She says the important issue is whether she can identify the statements or events behind her criticism. That answer frustrates Megyn because she believes the discussion is being reduced to individual facts while ignoring the larger context. Megyn continues by asking Megyn to identify one specific example of something she has reported incorrectly. Megyn does not provide a single statement immediately. Instead, she returns to the broader issue of how she has been portrayed over the years. The conversation has now moved beyond a simple disagreement about media coverage. Megyn is questioning Megyn's intentions, while Megyn is asking Megyn to provide specific evidence for her criticism. The tension is becoming harder to ignore, and the next question is likely to determine whether the interview can continue calmly. Meghan Markle becomes more direct when she challenges Megyn Kelly's approach to the interview. She says that the questions may sound neutral, but the way they are presented can still influence how viewers understand the story. Megyn disagrees. She explains that asking difficult questions does not mean she has already decided the answer. Her position is that Megyn should be able to respond to the questions and explain anything she believes has been misunderstood. Megyn says that is precisely the problem. In her view, the same questions have been repeated for years, even after she has already provided explanations. She argues that continuing to return to those subjects creates the impression that her answers were never accepted in the first place. Megyn asks Megyn to identify which specific question is unfair. Megyn points to the repeated discussion of her public statements and personal decisions. She says the coverage often connects separate events and presents them as evidence of a larger pattern. Megyn responds that patterns are sometimes relevant, especially when they involve statements made publicly over a long period of time. She says examining those patterns is part of understanding a public figure's record. Megyn then questions whether Megyn would apply the same standard to other celebrities and public figures. Megyn says the standard should be the same. If someone makes a public claim, journalists and commentators can question it, regardless of who made it. The disagreement becomes more focused. Megyn is asking for greater context and fairness, while Megyn is asking for specific evidence that her reporting was inaccurate. Neither side changes position. Megyn feels that Megyn's approach is unfairly critical, while Megyn believes Megyn is challenging the questions instead of addressing them directly. The conversation is now moving toward a much more sensitive subject. Megyn Kelly then moves the conversation toward Meghan Markle's media career and the projects she has pursued since leaving royal duties. She asks about the expectations surrounding those projects and whether the results have matched the public promises made when they were announced. Megyn explains that entertainment and media projects often change during development. Not every idea reaches the final stage, and she says that does not necessarily mean a project has failed. Megyn accepts that projects can change, but she asks whether the public deserves a clearer explanation when highly publicized plans do not move forward. Megyn says private business decisions should remain private. She argues that there is a difference between discussing her work publicly and revealing confidential details about contracts, negotiations, or companies. Megyn responds that she is not asking for confidential information. She is asking about the difference between expectations and results. That distinction becomes important. Megyn feels that the question is designed to create another negative impression about her career. Megyn maintains that she is simply asking whether the original expectations were realistic. Megyn pushes back and says that commentators have repeatedly treated changes in her professional plans as evidence that something has gone wrong. Megyn asks whether Megyn believes every criticism of her career is unfair simply because it is negative. Megyn says criticism is acceptable, but she believes the criticism should be based on complete information. Megyn replies that complete information is exactly what she is trying to obtain by asking questions. The exchange remains verbal, but the tone becomes noticeably more serious. Megyn appears increasingly frustrated with the direction of the interview, while Megyn continues with the same direct approach. The issue is no longer only about individual projects. It has become a disagreement over how Megyn's professional record should be examined, and whether difficult questions are legitimate scrutiny or unnecessary criticism. The conversation becomes more tense when Meghan Markle directly challenges Megyn Kelly over the way she has covered her in the past. Megyn says that the repeated focus on controversy makes it difficult for audiences to see anything beyond the criticism surrounding her. Megyn responds that her responsibility is not to protect Megyn's public image. Her role, she explains, is to ask questions and discuss issues that are already part of the public record. Megyn argues that there is a difference between asking questions and repeatedly presenting the same negative interpretation. She says that when criticism continues without acknowledging her explanations, it can appear that the conclusion was decided in advance. Megyn asks Megyn to give one example of a question she has refused to answer fairly. Megyn points to the broader pattern of coverage rather than one individual question. She says the problem is the overall treatment she has received from commentators. Megyn replies that a general accusation is difficult to address without specific examples. She again asks Megyn to identify something she believes was factually incorrect. The exchange becomes sharper. Megyn says Megyn is focusing on technical details instead of understanding the larger issue. Megyn maintains that specific details matter because they allow claims to be checked rather than debated only on opinion. Megyn then questions whether Megyn is genuinely interested in her answers. Megyn says she is, but explains that being interested in an answer does not mean agreeing with it. That statement becomes an important point in the discussion. Megyn wants recognition of her perspective, while Megyn wants to test that perspective through direct questions. Neither woman appears willing to change her position. The conversation remains controlled, but the disagreement is now clearly personal in tone. What began as a discussion about media coverage has become a direct argument about credibility, fairness, and whether Megyn believes Megyn is willing to give her a genuine opportunity to explain herself. Megyn Kelly continues the interview by asking Meghan Markle one more question about the way she responds to criticism. Megyn points out that whenever difficult subjects are raised, Megyn often argues that the question itself is unfair rather than addressing the specific issue. Megyn disagrees with that assessment. She says she has answered difficult questions many times and that constantly returning to the same subjects does not make the discussion more productive. Megyn asks whether Megyn believes she should be able to decide which questions are acceptable before answering them. Megyn says she simply expects reasonable questions and does not believe an interview should become an opportunity to repeatedly challenge her character. Megyn responds that she has not questioned Megyn's character. She has questioned statements, decisions, and public claims that have already been discussed publicly. Megyn becomes increasingly frustrated and tells Megyn that the interview is no longer constructive. She says she came prepared to have a conversation, not to defend herself against what she considers a predetermined narrative. Megyn remains firm and says that disagreement with the questions does not mean the questions are inappropriate. At that point, Megyn indicates that she does not want to continue under those conditions. She makes it clear that she would rather end the interview than continue answering questions she believes are being framed unfairly. Megyn tells her that ending the interview is her choice, but she does not withdraw the questions or apologize for asking them. The exchange reaches its clearest breaking point. There is no agreement between them, and neither side appears willing to change its position. Megyn begins preparing to leave, while Megyn maintains that she has simply done what she would do with any public figure: ask difficult questions and allow the audience to judge the answers. The interview is now close to ending, but the disagreement itself remains unresolved. Meghan Markle decides that she no longer wants to continue the interview. She explains that she came to have a serious conversation but believes the discussion has become focused too heavily on criticism of her. Megyn Kelly does not try to force the conversation to continue. She tells Megyn that she is free to leave if she does not want to answer further questions. This is where the idea of Meghan being kicked off the show needs to be understood carefully. The disagreement does not require a dramatic removal or confrontation. The more straightforward interpretation is that the interview reaches a point where continuing is no longer productive, and Meghan chooses to end her appearance. Meghan stands by her decision. She says that she does not believe remaining in the interview will change Meghan's approach or the way her answers will be presented. Meghan responds that Meghan came onto the program knowing that difficult questions would be asked. She says that ending the interview does not resolve the issues they were discussing. Meghan disagrees and maintains that she has already explained her position. The exchange remains tense, but both sides are now focused on ending the conversation rather than continuing the argument. Meghan leaves the interview, bringing the discussion to an abrupt conclusion. Meghan remains in the studio and does not follow her. Instead, she prepares to address the audience about what just happened. The central disagreement remains clear. Meghan believes she was being subjected to unfair questioning, while Meghan believes she was conducting a legitimate interview. Whether viewers would see the departure as a justified decision or an unwillingness to continue answering difficult questions would ultimately depend on how they interpreted the exchange. And that leaves Meghan with the opportunity to explain her side directly to the audience. After Meghan Markle leaves, Megyn Kelly turns her attention back to the audience and explains how she viewed the interview. She makes it clear that she did not expect Meghan to agree with every question, but she expected her to address the subjects being discussed. Meghan says that disagreement is normal in an interview. A guest can challenge a question, correct an assumption, or provide a different perspective. What matters, in her view, is whether the conversation can continue with specific answers. She explains that her questions were based on statements and decisions that Meghan had discussed publicly. Meghan says she was not asking about private information simply for the sake of creating controversy. According to Meghan's position, the purpose of the interview was to give Meghan an opportunity to explain her perspective directly. If Meghan believed previous coverage was inaccurate, Meghan argues that the interview provided a chance to identify those inaccuracies. Meghan also addresses the criticism that her questions were too direct. She says that being direct is not the same as being disrespectful. A difficult question can still be legitimate, even when the person answering it does not appreciate the subject. At the same time, Meghan acknowledges that Meghan had every right to end the interview. She says a guest should not be forced to continue a conversation they no longer want to have. The important issue, from Meghan's perspective, is what the disagreement revealed about interviews involving highly scrutinized public figures. Meghan wanted more control over how her story was discussed. Meghan wanted the freedom to question that story. Neither position automatically makes one side right, but the disagreement explains why the interview reached a point where continuing became difficult. The confrontation between Meghan Markle and Megyn Kelly ultimately raises a larger question about the relationship between public figures and the media. Meghan's position is that repeated criticism can become unfair when journalists continue to focus on the same controversies without giving enough attention to the explanations she has already provided. From her perspective, the problem is not simply the questions themselves, but the way those questions can shape public perception. Meghan's position is different. She believes that public statements and decisions can be examined, especially when the person involved has discussed those subjects openly. For her, asking difficult questions is part of accountability, not necessarily a personal attack. That difference explains much of the tension between them. Meghan appears to want greater control over the context surrounding her story, while Meghan insists that an interviewer must be willing to challenge a guest when she believes clarification is necessary. The disagreement also shows why interviews involving highly recognizable public figures can become difficult. A guest may believe the interviewer has already formed an opinion, while the interviewer may believe the guest is avoiding specific questions. Neither side necessarily has to agree with the other. The important point is whether the questions are reasonable, whether the answers are given an opportunity to be heard, and whether the audience can make its own judgment. The ending of the interview leaves those questions unresolved. Meghan leaves believing the conversation has become unfair, while Meghan remains convinced that she was simply doing her job. That is what makes the confrontation significant. It is not only about two people disagreeing. It is about where the line should be drawn between tough questioning and unfair treatment. In the end, the disagreement between Meghan Markle and Megyn Kelly comes down to one basic question. When does tough questioning become unfair, and when does criticism become a legitimate part of public discussion? Meghan's decision to end the interview reflects her belief that the conversation was no longer giving her a fair opportunity to explain herself. Meghan, on the other hand, maintains that difficult questions are part of interviewing public figures, especially when those subjects have already been discussed publicly. Whether Meghan was actually kicked off the show or simply chose to end the conversation is an important distinction. The larger issue is what happened during the exchange and why the two sides could not reach common ground. For Meghan, the experience would reinforce her concerns about how she is treated by certain commentators. For Meghan, it would reinforce her belief that journalists and commentators should not avoid difficult questions simply because a guest is uncomfortable with them. There may not be a clear winner in a disagreement like this. The audience ultimately decides which position makes more sense. So, what do you think? Was Megyn Kelly right to keep asking difficult questions? Or did the interview cross the line into unfair criticism? And do you think Meghan Markle was right to end the conversation? Share your opinion in the comments. If you found this discussion interesting, like the video and subscribe for more coverage of major celebrity interviews and media controversies.